Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to EWTN Live. We bring you guests from around the world, and we're talking today with a great friend of my own, the network. He's been here many years, and a top-notch church historian, Father Charles Connor. We're talking about Catholicism during the American Civil War and how the Catholic Church in this country worked and prayed for the success of both sides. But before we get into that, we want to talk briefly with EWTN's Director of Acquisitions and Co-Productions, Mr. John Elson, about a brand new television program that we're going to have on the Catholic Church in Korea. It'll be debuting soon. John, you doing all right?
I'm doing great, Father.
Good,
Thank you.
good.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Same here.
Yeah.
And what's this about the Korean church?
Yeah, well,
on
on Friday, September 20th, we will be premiering an exciting new program entitled Catholic Korea, the Martyrs. And as we know, September 20th is the feast day dedicated to St. Andrew Kim, Paul Ha-sung, and his companions. And this program talks about the brutal persecution of Catholics in the 18th century in Korea. Now, we know in the 1700s that the faith was brought to China, and shortly thereafter, Jesuit missionaries brought the faith to neighboring Korea. Now, during that time, there are two characteristics of Korea that's important to emphasize. One, it was ruled by a Joseon dynasty that had ruled the country from the late 1300s. And two, that it was a very hierarchical society that was governed and motivated by a Confucian ideology. And basically what that means is that the Confucianism was based on 5 primary relationships. For example, a man and woman, a parent and child, the king and the servant. And so although initially the elites in Korea were intrigued by this Christianity and this Catholicism because they saw it as driving the progress of the Western world. However, as these Catholics in Korea began to have their prayer meetings, they called them, in their Korean language, the gathering of friends. So these aristocratic people and these poor people, these men and these women, were all praying together. And that was seen as very threatening to the Confucian hierarchical divisions of people. These Catholics proclaimed that all were equal, that all were made in the image and likeness of God. And also they proclaimed that Jesus Christ was the true king. So therefore, the king of Korea saw this as a tremendous existential threat.
Herod had the same problem,
Herod had the same threat.
Yeah.
And so in 1786, he outlawed Catholicism in the country. So anyone that was seen as who expressed their faith or tried to promulgate the faith, spread the faith, was brutally martyred. So that caused many Catholics to flee into the forests and the mountains of Korea. And many became earthenware potters. So these earthenware pots served as, if you will, pre-modern refrigerators. And so they did that to survive economically, and also it allowed them to spread the faith. Why? Well, the potters were the lowest of the lowest rung in society. So these Catholics were able to spread the faith by putting notes in these pots, making etchings and writings and catechetical messages in these pots. So the faith was able to continue to grow despite the persecution. So we have a short clip to show everyone.
Yeah, let's take a look at that clip real quickly.
35 miles to the north of Seoul lies one of the most heavily militarized and guarded areas in the world, the border with North Korea. Today, that's what the world knows this region as, North and South Korea. But in the past, this was one country. It was Korea. Christianity had already begun to spread in neighboring country China in the 1700s, and during trips to Korea, a number of Jesuit missionaries brought with them philosophical literature and Catholic Church teachings. Previously, the king was, in essence, their god, but then this new religion taught people that the one who really reigns is Jesus Christ. In an effort to stop the spread of Christianity, the king declared Christians should be pushed to the very bottom of the class structure and ordered that those caught practicing their faith or helping in the spread of the faith be tortured and killed. A fight for religious freedom to the death.
this is going to be shown on Friday, September 20th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Saturday, September 21st at 2:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And also, you can see it at the website, EWTN.com. And it's really interesting because Korea is on its way to becoming a fully Christian country, the second one in Asia after the Philippines.
That's
so
right.
Very exciting.
It really is.
John, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with tonight's guest, Father Connor, so please stay with us. Thank you, and welcome back. Guest tonight is a good friend. He's a professor at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, a noted church historian, and his latest project details the rise of a uniquely Catholic, American part of Catholicism before the Civil War, during it, and then in the period of Reconstruction afterwards. And how that deadliest of all American wars enculturated a Catholic Church in this country. It was a combination of visionary leadership and moral blindness, not unlike situations that we have in the country, including in the church today. So please welcome author of Faith and Fury, the Rise of Catholicism During the Civil War, Father Charles Connor.
Father, thank you.
Good
Always
to
an
have
honor to
you.
be back with you. But I must start off and express my disappointment.
Yes?
Yeah, well, you said I was from Mount St. Mary's, but
Yes.
you didn't say where it was. And there's two Mount St. Mary's.
Oh, are there?
There's one in Cincinnati, I believe.
Oh,
but
that's...
We're the Mount St. Mary's at Emmitsburg, Maryland, an extraordinarily fine, wonderful seminary.
And I've been to the one in Cincinnati only, so I should have
You've not
said...
been to the Mount?
No.
Father, you have missed the Catholic gem of your life. Absolutely, you must visit us. Come and give us a retreat to the community sometime.
Sure.
I'll put a bug in the rector's ear.
Okay.
Very wonderful rector, Monsignor Andrew Baker, who told me, gave me instructions that I was to mention Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg 5 times during this program tonight.
Oh, we've got
now,
3.
do you think I can get it in 5 times?
Oh, we got 3
You'll
so
have to
far.
work us around mentioning Mount St. Mary's, a seminary filled almost to capacity, and a seminary of marvelous, marvelous young men.
And that is a very good thing, because not only Mount St. Mary's, 4th time, but
Mount St. Mary's, Emmitsburg,
but a number of other seminaries are also chock full.
Oh, yes, they are. That's very true.
There are a number of seminaries that are chock full, and that's a good thing.
They're not all as fine as ours, however. You know what I mean.
I don't need to step in that mess.
No, indeed you don't. But I'm happy to be on the air and be able to say that and to talk about the marvelous quality of seminarians we have in the church today. There's no question about it.
Really,
but now on to the Civil War, which
this is the second part, and the second part of your series. You're doing a series of books.
Yes.
You've done the first one about the early pioneer priests during the colonial period.
The colonial, revolutionary, constitutional, early national years, yes.
And now
this is
a sequel to it.
That's right.
We'll be looking for the next one.
Well, it's about to get started.
Good. But this is one of the things I loved about your book is that you really prepare for understanding what was going on in the country prior to the Civil War. You don't just go into the battles.
Right.
They're very interesting. There are a lot of documentaries on that, but you can't understand the Civil War without knowing more than 20, 30 years earlier. Just give us a quick rundown of some of the key elements that prepared the way for this catastrophe.
Absolutely. Well, you have, as you say, you have to go back a number of decades to really understand. And I think when you look at the whole picture, what led up to the, let us say, the period, 20 years prior to the period of what we call the coming of the Civil War. Then the period we call the coming of the Civil War, 1848 to the outbreak of hostilities in 61, the 4 years of the war, and then finally Reconstruction. All of these put together continually prove the truth of what Cardinal John Henry Newman once said about the study of church history. No sooner do we finish chanting our Alleluias than we begin to sing our Misereres. In other words, it's the ebb and flow, you know, the high and the low, the successes and the disappointments. And this has been the story of U.S. Catholicism really since 1634. But in this case, some of the points that we try to make in Faith and Fury, a book which, incidentally, our rector tells me I should have subtitled, How I Survived the Battle of Gettysburg. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Isn't that something? Well, I kind of go back that far.
Not quite. You're younger than I am. So
by how much?
A year.
1 year, same day, right. In any event, Father, to begin, as you look at this particular period of United States Catholic history, you have to preface it with the decades that went before, especially with the tremendous influx of Catholic immigrants that were coming into the United States. It was becoming the church of the urban, you know, the city dweller. It had been very much an aristocratic setting prior to that in colonial Maryland, the people that the Jesuits worked with there. But now you had this tremendous influx from Ireland certainly would be the greatest country numerically. Right. And then following the Irish, you had the migrations of the German Catholics, which would be somewhat less in number in those years, but still very significant. And of course, the Irish largely stayed at on the eastern seaboard. Very, very often the German Catholics would go to the Midwest and settle there.
The Germans wanted to go off to be farmers.
That's right.
And
that's
the
true.
Irish tended to stay more urban. What you bring out about the disappointment in farming that led to their famine.
Oh, sure.
You know, made them not interested in the
And yet Archbishop Hughes was very, very much opposed to any type of Western colonization for them because he thought that they would become too separated from the mainstream of American life if they did that, surprisingly enough. Yeah. But in any event, so you have these city dwellers, the Irish, and then you have the Germans. With this tremendous Catholic pouring into the country, you had a backlash on the part of Protestant America. It was sort of one group versus another. There was group security, and there had been group security since the early colonial period here. And now that group security was being threatened. And the response of that threatening, of course, was the nativist uprising, the nativist impulse, if you will, which traces its origins to the 1830s, but became very strong in the 40s and stayed very strong in the 50s. And what you had in this all-encompassing term that we call nativism, you had a great deal of stump oratory. You had people like Lyman Beecher, who was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, you know, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. One of the leading ministers in the country to pounce on the Catholic Church at every possible opportunity he could find. And he was very, very vocal in his opposition to the church. So you had oratory. You also had scurrilous literature that was published. You know, you had the awful disclosures of Maria Monk, Rebecca Reed's 6 months in a convent. You had a work by Samuel Finley Breese Morse of Telegraph fame, and you had William Craig Brownlee's American Protestant Vindicator, and on and on.
Yeah, people don't realize that Samuel Morse, who came up with Morse code, and the telegraph, was very anti-Catholic.
Blatantly anti-Catholic. And So you had the literature, and you had the oratory, and then of course you had episodes of violence. You know, the burning of the Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts in the 1830s. You had the Kensington riots in Philadelphia in the mid-1840s. And then, of course, going into the 1850s, you had the rise of the Know Nothing Party, and they became extremely vocal, particularly during the visit of Archbishop Gaetano Bedini to the United States, which is a story in itself. Well, in any event, all of these things are building up, and we're getting, on the one hand, a tremendous growth of the physical plan of the Catholic Church in the United States, but tremendous opposition had already been very, very forthcoming in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. So our forebears in this country knew bigotry. They knew it inside out. They were the victims of it so many, many times. Now, when we come to the war itself, we have very, very much a shift away from that. People are not going to be preoccupied with fighting the Catholics when you have such a tremendous melancholy strife, as Archbishop Hughes diplomatically called it, about to begin. And of course, it did begin with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in 1861. So you have these 4 years of war. The 4 years of war, if anything positive can be said to be coming out of war, one thing positive for the church was the tremendous opportunity that hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of enlisted men, Catholic enlisted men, were able to, the service they were able to perform for their respective governments, whether they were fighting for the Union or whether they were fighting for the Confederacy. They were very, very much fighting and very much part and parcel of that conflict. And their fellow Americans could look at this expression of patriotism, if you will, expression of fighting for what you believed in, even to the point of going to war and fighting to the nth degree, let us say. And you know, it really, really contributed for some years to a tempering of the Native American mind on the subject of Catholics. Well, maybe these Catholics aren't that bad after all. And so, as I say, that was a great opportunity that we had, though it's kind of it almost seems like a contradiction in terms to be talking about the killings of war and all that war implies. But it was a display.
Happened at other times too. You know,
oh, indeed, it did many times.
World Wars,
many times.
You know, Catholics fighting alongside everybody else.
Everybody else, sure.
And after Korea, that happened for the African American community as well. That the military gave a certain kind of camaraderie that had men see each other in battle as equals.
That's right.
And so it's had that fact as a popular army, or not, by popular army I mean an army of the populace. Rather than a professional army.
That's right, absolutely true.
So that's one element. But you know, one of the things that I think is also important about your section in 1848 to 1860 is, you know, what was the war about? And, you know, you'll have people emphasize, especially Southerners, that it was states' rights, and Northerners will emphasize that it was to maintain the unity of the country.
That's true. That's right.
And the unspoken issue was slavery.
Slavery, however, was a manifestation of really what the war was fought over. And you're absolutely correct when you talk about these various theories of government. That's what we were fighting about. Slavery was the manifestation of that. So you had in the northern part of the United States, you had what we would call the organic theory of government. It was the theory that most of our politicians and so forth would have espoused. It was the theory of government which simply said that 13 states had originally come together, and they had created a federal government of expressed, enumerated, delegated, and implied powers. And any residual powers that were left over, shall we say, were to be left to the individual concerns of those 13 states. Now, the compact theory of government was something very, very different. The compact theory of government, which would have been the Southern position, and the position constitutionally, in their minds, justifying the existence of slavery, said that there were 13 individual states who maintained their sovereignty, who gave this federal government just as much power as they thought it should have, and not a bit more. And if that federal government in any way, shape, or form usurped that which they had given, or usurped that which they thought was the prerogative of the government they had created, then they were perfectly free to withdraw from that government and, for that matter, create another one, I suppose. That was the theory, and slavery was simply the particular issue over which they were fighting. But it was a different governmental structure. And we also, I think, have to remember here that Catholics in the United States were just as divided sectionally as were all their other fellow Americans. A study of the church really teaches us this, and you'll find it very clearly among the hierarchy, for example.
Yep.
You have the famous Hughes-Lynch correspondence. John Hughes, who was the graduate, by the way, of Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, Father.
That's
How many
five.
times have I said it now?
5.
Are you sure it's 5?
I counted.
I thought it was only 3. I got
know.
it in.
Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Well, in any event, he was a graduate, one of our esteemed graduates. The log cabin that he lived in when he was a janitor is still on our grounds there. But in any event, John Hughes carried on a correspondence with Patrick Lynch, who was the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina. And if you ever wanted the organic versus the compact theory of government expressed by 2 Catholic bishops in a series of correspondence in newspapers, there you have it. Another interesting thing about both Hughes and Lynch, which I think proves his point, is the fact that both of these men undertook diplomatic missions for their respective governments. Archbishop Hughes went to France at the bequest of the Lincoln administration, and most particularly the Secretary of State, William H. Seward, who was a great and close friend of Hughes, and who probably lost the nomination.
Same Seward who bought Alaska.
He was, and absolutely, that was some years later. Same Seward who had been governor of New York and 20 years earlier and favored the cause of financial aid to Catholic schools when Hughes was bishop in his early years in New York. In 1860, the Republicans were a new party. They knew they had to have at least a certain degree of know-nothing support to win the election. The know-nothings would not support the newly formed Republican Party if Seward were the nominee, because Seward had one time favored Catholic interests. He was knocked out of the nomination, and it went to Lincoln instead. Well, in any event, because of the influence of Seward, Archbishop Hughes undertook this diplomatic mission to France. He was successful in the sense that he did indeed ensure French neutrality during the war. Bishop Hughes, at the request of Jefferson Davis and Judah P. Benjamin.
Lynch.
Yeah, what did I say?
Hughes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Patrick Neeson Lynch.
Right.
At the request of Jefferson Davis and his Secretary of State, Judah P. Benjamin, undertook a mission to the Vatican. The purpose of that mission was to try to secure official Vatican recognition for the legitimacy of the Confederate States of America. In that sense, Bishop Lynch was not successful in his mission. But the point of it is the divisions, the political divisions that divided all of America, divided Catholics as well. But the unity, I keep interrupting you. I know you want to get something in here, but here's the important thing. The unity of the church, the doctrinal unity of the church, was never for one split second compromised.
Yeah. The only thing I was going to say is that there were also divisions among the bishops as well as the laity on the issue of slavery.
Very, very much so. And
Pope Gregory the 16th had repeated what had been stated by popes going back to the 15th century when slavery, Atlantic slave trade started. And Pope Gregory the 16th, it said the slave trade is a sin and it's automatic excommunication.
Also, the slavery, the institution of slavery, Gregory morally condemned.
That's
not
right.
just the trade,
right.
but positively. It was a universal moral condemnation for centuries by various popes addressing themselves to different parts of the world. So we come to the United States. Why didn't it happen here? That's the
right.
question.
Why? Because they were divided. Why were they divided on this clear teaching?
We have to remember a few things. First of all, when we were coming to when we were approaching the Civil War in these years, we were really the last vestige in Western civilization that hung on to the institution of slavery. England had abolished it 30-some years before we did. And it was an existing social institution in this country really since 1607 with the colony of Jamestown, Virginia. And of course it contributed obviously to the economic aggrandizement of the South. It made the South as prosperous as it was, and it was found primarily there, as we know so well. And so it was very, very much a local geographic concern, if you want to look at it that way. Now, there are a few things. It had been an existing social institution, as I say, since 1607. Now we're 260 years almost removed from that. The bishops, like so many other Americans, and that's why the bishops may not be singled out for great criticism here, not at all. I think it's terribly unfair, because they, like the overwhelming majority of Americans, were of a conservative nature and did not want to overthrow an existing social institution. You start to look like you're some kind of a fanatic when you do it. If you go back to 1830, we always talk about the beginnings of what was known as the abolitionist movement, really beginning literally on New Year's Day, 1830, when William Lloyd Garrison wrote the first issue of his newspaper, The Liberator. And that really got the abolitionist movement going. Now, they were portrayed and they were seen as real extremists, these people who wanted to do away with slavery, expressing a moral opposition. So many Americans looked at them. Well, there's something kooky about that. They want to overturn the basic rudiments of our society here. It was, and I emphasize it was a moral opposition to slavery, and quite obviously a very, very correct moral opposition to slavery. They believed slavery was an institution that held human beings in bondage, and they were strongly morally opposed to it. The problem, however, was that they also believed that the Catholic Church was an institution which held human beings in spiritual bondage. People are told what to believe. People are subject to the Pope. It's this very, very foreign, and we were considered the foreign element in the United States. We were not real Americans. We were different, and in the American Protestant mind, we should not be here at all. Now, that being the case, under no circumstance could our bishops begin to affiliate with these abolitionists who hated the Catholic Church as much as they hated slavery. Hence, there's a strong reason there, I think, why the bishops would have been, they may have had personal moral objections themselves, but they were not going to publicly unite themselves with this particular group of people. What they did do, however, they clearly distinguished between the institution of slavery as an existing social institution, upon which very little comment was made, but the slave trade, a stronger moral condemnation of the buying and selling of human beings you would not find from anyone more so than Catholic bishops in the United States. And then, of course, they pastorally went on to talk about the very, very serious moral obligations that slave owners had in regard to their slaves, teaching them the rudiments of the faith, teaching basic elements of morality, and so on and so forth, instructing them, giving them the sacraments.
And that was especially true in the old French colony area of Louisiana.
Very much in Louisiana. Absolutely right. So. What happened, of course, with the whole slavery question, obviously with Lincoln's emancipation and so forth in 63, the sadder chapter, the very, very, very sad chapter in United States Catholic history came very shortly after the Civil War. In fact, really just a year after. In 1866, you had the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore, and there was a move on the part of some of the participants in that council, a move in favor of a strong emphasis on black evangelization following the war, taking the newly freed slave population and going, with very serious evangelizing efforts to wherever they were going to be found to bring them in and to convert them to the Catholic faith. Cardinal McCluskey of New York, who, by the way, was a graduate of
Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg?
Positively. McCluskey...
6!
McCluskey wrote a letter to Martin John Spaulding, who was then the Archbishop of Baltimore, talking about black evangelization. And he said, this is a golden opportunity, and if it is lost now, it may never come back again. It was lost, and it never came back.
Yep, he was right.
Very, very, very sad chapter in United States Catholic history.
And in general, the confusion after or during Reconstruction in the South was itself painful on lots of different levels. You know, you have the government of President Andrew Johnson, not really enthusiastic himself. He was himself from Kentucky, Tennessee. So he's a Southerner himself.
Indeed,
and he was a Democrat, not a Republican.
That's correct. Sure.
But Lincoln incorporated him.
His wife taught him how to read and write.
Yeah.
He was a tailor.
And you know, this was you know, his sympathies on Reconstruction were problematic, and then Grant's administration, Grant was too weak.
Oh, Grant was militantly anti-Catholic. We'll get to that in a moment if we have time.
Yeah.
But I'd like to backtrack for just a moment. Even before the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1866, in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, you had the fact that the boarding house in Washington, where Booth and the conspirators met and to plan the abduction and the murder of the president, was of course owned by Mrs. Mary Surratt, who was a very devout practicing Catholic, as was her son John Surratt. Then there is the famous story, you know, of Booth breaking his leg when he fell from the presidential booth, you know, and he landed down on the stage and ran out through the stage and so forth, made his way to Southern Maryland. And in Southern Maryland, his wounds were tended to by Dr. Samuel Mudd, a very devout Catholic in Waldorf, Maryland, Southern Maryland. He was wearing a disguise, and apparently Dr. Mudd did not recognize him. He had met him once before, about a year earlier. Booth had actually gone there to buy a horse. And Dr. Mudd met him at St. Mary's, Bryantown, took him to the barn where he had his horses, you know, and Booth apparently bought a horse from him. A year later, he comes with these sideburns, you know, that you can glue on, and a large beard and so forth, and the like. And Dr. Mudd did not recognize him that night. The next morning, Mrs. Mudd records, and we have this in the book, that as John Wilkes Booth's friend was helping him out to go down the porch and to leave, you know, to get on the horse and leave, she thought she could see some of the sideburner pulling off, you know, and she got very suspicious. Now, she didn't know who it was, of course, but the reason we tell these stories, immediately there was a perception in the non-Catholic mind that there was a Catholic conspiracy to kill Lincoln. And this was, you know, this was blasted over American newspapers. And once again, no more than what we had in the 1840s. I mean, the American, certain percentage anyway, of the American reading public were only too delighted to believe something like this.
Right.
Lincoln, by the way, had Catholic first cousins himself. Yeah. They were very active in his presidential campaigns. Lincoln was anything but anti-Catholic, and that was known. Right. But they would believe anything. You know, divisive about Catholics.
Especially after the Maria Monk falsehoods and all that.
Absolutely, yes.
Look, it's a wonderful book, you know, and I hope you all get a chance. But we have to take a break right now. We'll come back because you may have some more questions and comments about all this. So please stay with us. for some questions?
Well, I'm sure we'll have questions. Now, whether I'm ready with the answers, that's another.
Let's see. Well, let's start off with this first one.
Here we go.
Gaetano, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Where are you? Yeah, where are you from?
Elwood City, Pennsylvania, just north of Pittsburgh.
Wonderful. Yeah. And your question?
Well, what I had was a comment. We're talking about the Civil War. And at the Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh, they had a whole program on the Civil War. And what was interesting, they told about the nuns, the Catholic nuns that were the nurses during the Civil War that took care of both sides, both the South and the Northern soldiers. And at the end of the war, President Lincoln, and I saw the letters, had written letters to the group of nuns thanking them for the service that they put forth. And I just thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely, indeed it is. There's a very, very impressive monument in front of St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C., giving credit really to all the many orders of religious sisters who were served as nurses and so forth. Their work was incalculable. There were at least 5 different communities that I can recall offhand that contributed. Certainly the largest number, however, of religious sisters who served as nurses were, of course, Mother Seton's Sisters of Charity. And they, of course, were located in
Emmitsburg, Maryland.
Very excellent. Very. What's that? 7 times. All right. In any event, they certainly provided the largest number. The Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of Loretto, I believe, were another group.
The Nashville Dominicans.
The Nashville Dominicans, absolutely, yes.
Their convent is up on a hill on the north side of
Nashville. Yes.
And it was very much loved as a convent during, as a hospital during the Battle of Nashville. Which
yes,
that
indeed.
and the Battle of Franklin were very big battles.
Franklin, right. And they as I say, contributed so very, very much. But we talk about individual sisters in this book because some of them became so well known in their own right for their works of mercy that they would be tendered all kinds of testimonials, and of course upon their death they would be posthumously awarded all kinds of honorary degrees and all that, just citing their valor. What was so important about these sisters, I think, was the fact that, first of all, there were a tremendous number of conversions to the Catholic faith on the part of these soldiers who either came from other religious traditions or no religious background at all. They were received into the church. And there were also an equally large number, if not even more, who had given up the practice of the faith and came back to the faith because of the influence of these marvelous women.
Yeah.
They worked day and night, uncomplaining. I mean, they were the saints of the battlefield. There's no question about it. As I said, there were just, as I recall, I think it was 5 different orders contributed very substantially. And we do talk about in the book about some specific sisters who really were well known.
Great. Let's take another question from our studio. Sir, where are you from?
I'm Steve, and I'm from Birmingham.
Great. And your question?
Well, first of all, thank you, Father Connor, for your work for history, especially in the day we live in when the trend is to forget history instead of learn from it. Yeah. But my question is, if you could spend a few minutes talking about Catholic priests who served in various capacities on both sides of the conflict, even on the battlefield itself sometimes. So.
Oh, sure. Priests really rendered a wonderful contribution in many, many areas. They were chaplains, as you say. They were writers. They were poets and the like. One of the first ones that comes to my mind in the Union Army would have been Father William Corby. Corby was a Holy Cross priest from the University of Notre Dame. And there's the very famous painting of Father Corby granting general absolution, to the soldiers before they went out in battle. There are stories galore.
By the way, so folks understand.
Oh, yes,
when you're going off to battle, or you're in a sinking ship, or a plane that's crashing, you can have general absolution.
But
not when you're just in a regular parish.
Yes, but then we have the requirement to go to confession. Definitely.
Yeah,
if we're in the state of mortal sin. Yeah,
if you survive.
Thank you, Father. I should have said that. And that's
every so often we have people that were trying to go for general absolution.
Oh, indeed.
But those days are kind of fading.
Please God. God.
But in battle, that's a legitimate thing.
In battle, it's a very legitimate thing. Yeah. Oh, sure. Father Corby was, and there was an interesting story about Father Corby going going to see President Lincoln it was a very personal mission for a man who, in the end, he was not able to save. This man had been involved in all kinds of chicanery, you know, and Father Corby genuinely felt sorry for him and thought that his life might be spared. And he was sitting in the White House with Lincoln for quite a while, and he got up to leave. He said, because the president seemed so confused and just not able to say anything proper to the priest because he didn't know enough of the information, and he was befuddled, and he did not want to come out and say, oh yes, absolutely, I will pardon him, without knowing the situation. So Father Corby's leaving. It was all very cordial and all, and finally Lincoln said, now see here, chaplain, I just want to let you know I will pardon that man if General Meade will pardon him. Meade was the Union commander, of course, at Gettysburg. And it was a lack of communication between Meade, Father Corby, and getting back to the president. The man was scheduled to be executed at a certain hour. Unfortunately, did lose his life. But I mean, yeah. Father Corby really went to bat for him. He was an outstanding one. Father James Gillen is another name that comes to mind. Also with the Union, he was also a Holy Cross priest from Notre Dame, and he would be following the lines, and he was unassigned. And Grant came across him and asked him, well, you know, under what circumstance or why are you here, and so forth. And Gillen said, well, I'm not officially commissioned. I'm just here as a priest. And Grant was ready to throw him in jail immediately. And again, a friend of Father Gillen's, whom Grant knew, came to the priest's attention. But Grant had much anti-Catholicism in him. There's no question about that. That was proven in the 1870s after the war was over, while he was president. So that would be, Father Gillen would be another great example. Father John Bannon was a great Confederate chaplain. He was a native Irishman, born and raised in Ireland, and he was actually sent by the Confederate government, by President Davis, back to his native land of Ireland. So many young Irishmen were coming over here to the United States, and the overwhelming majority of them landed in New York. And, you know, the enlistment men would be there signing them right up for the Union Army. And the Confederacy wanted to see if Father Bannon could, in any way, shape, or form, dissuade these young men from just automatically signing up. And, of course, he did that. He was a magnificent speaker, and he would go all over Ireland preaching in the various parishes, talking to the people about the incorrectness of the Northern cause. He eventually stayed in Ireland, and what order do you think he joined?
Society of Jesus?
Absolutely.
Well,
he was a Jesuit in Dublin for the remainder of his life, and a great Irish missionary. So he'd be another example. Father Abram Ryan would be another one, the so-called poet of the Confederacy. Led a somewhat roustabout life, but a very interesting life, and he was a Confederate chaplain, of course, and he's wrote very beautifully in verse about the Confederate cause, you know, is probably one of the better known, I think, of the priests of that period. Father John Bannister Tabb would be another very good example of a writer much in favor of the Confederate cause. He taught in St. Charles College in Catonsville, Maryland in his day. And I must tell you, if you wanted advocates of the Confederate cause, where do you think you found them institutionally? At?
Emmitsburg?
And whereabouts in Emmitsburg?
St. Mary's in Maryland?
Mount St. Mary's Seminary.
So, all right.
Our faculty was pro-South, our students. We had so many from New Orleans in those days and throughout Louisiana.
I see.
Loads and loads. But it really was quite a hotbed of Confederate support right in the little town of Emmitsburg. It's very interesting.
And Maryland itself was one of those border states.
Oh, yes, very divided allegiances.
Sympathy on both sides.
Oh, absolutely, yes, absolutely.
And and one of the things you mentioned about Grant's anti-Catholicism, I think that had a good deal to do with later on in the 1880s, the anti-Catholicism of the Republican Party.
Well,
no Romanism
and rebellion.
Rebellion.
That was Blaine in 1884. Yes, it did. But what happened in the 1870s, not long after Grant became president, it was an issue involving Bible reading in public schools in the United States. And the American bishops objected, very correctly objected, to the fact that our Catholic children had to go to these public schools and listen to readings from the King James Version of the Bible. and have to read it themselves and listen to it being read. And the bishops, of course, were very, very, very much opposed that Catholic children should be reading the Catholic version of the Scriptures. And the thing became so heated in various school districts and the like that different state legislatures actually landed up passing pieces of legislation outlawing any kind of Bible reading in public school. Well, of course, the hostilities broke out once again. But Grant, as president, was particularly vocal about, number one, how divisive Catholic schools were to American liberty, and number two, how under no circumstance should any state monies ever go to the running of Catholic schools. And he got up at one convention after another expressing his views. Not the most prudent thing to do when you're an incumbent president, I wouldn't think. No. But nonetheless, he showed his anti-Catholic colors in that respect as well. It really did.
And that's something that showed up later on in the Supreme Court in the 1940s with Justice Hugo Black and others. So we have another caller. Hello, Jim?
Yes?
Hi, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Dubuque, Iowa.
Dubuque, Iowa. Great. And what is your question?
Well, I would like the good father's input on the Missouri Constitution of 1855. Excuse me, 1850. I'm sorry, I'm getting my numbers mixed up here. 1865. Written and promulgated while the war was still going on, but almost made Catholicism treasonous in the U.S.
You're talking about a Missouri state constitution, and what year was this written? I'm not familiar with the constitution you're talking about there, I don't think.
The Missouri state constitution.
Tell us a little more, Jim.
Yeah, you may know more about it than we do.
Oh, I'm sure he does. No, this does not sound familiar to me at all, but go right ahead, Jim.
Well, the state constitution, as passed, made it illegal for anyone who had offered any support for the rebel cause during the war in terms of food or clothing or anything, which meant that all these Catholic priests who had heard confessions of the rebels could not offer mass. They couldn't offer homilies, and they could not witness marriages unless they went down to the courthouse and signed a document that said that they had never done this. Well, of course they couldn't. They started arresting priests. The bishop of St. Louis showed up at the police station in full regalia, mitre, crozier, everything, with the Bible in hand to take his punishment. There was one priest who was tried and found guilty and was basically tortured in prison and later committed suicide. But it was only by a single vote of the U.S. Supreme Court that kept that from being allowed. Not because it was anti-religion, but because it would affect the lawyers.
What was the Supreme Court case? Do you recall the name of it?
Oh, I wish I could. I'm sorry.
We'll have to look it up.
There are similar stories to the one you're describing. When you were first starting, I thought you were going to ask about the Missouri Compromise some decades before. But this whole Constitution, now that's entirely new to me, but a very interesting story.
Yeah.
And there, as I said, there are similar anecdotes, we'll call them more than anecdotes, I guess, that come to us from around the country, this kind of anti-Catholicism that forms itself into legal documents, one way or another.
And there's a certain amount of that anti-Catholicism we started even hearing when certain Catholic justices or judges are brought before Senate and they're said, well, your doctrine speaks loudly, and other criticism of them being Catholic.
Yes, it reminds me too, going back to our own period here, there was an awful lot of criticism thrown at the Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney. Taney, you know, was a Catholic, came from Frederick, Maryland, not too far from us at all. And he was the one who wrote the Dred Scott decision, and his decision certainly would have been a result of his own juridical thinking, and he would have been strongly an advocate of this compact theory of government that we talked about earlier. Marshall was a judicial nationalist. You know, he favored a strong federal government. Taney gave much more say to the states, and that, of course, is what motivated him to some degree anyway. But Taney was tarred and feathered all over the United States, obviously, for his. Dred Scott, in the end, was buried in a Catholic cemetery in St. Louis. He's
Is
in
that right?
He's in Calvary Cemetery. I don't believe he ever formally became a Catholic, but he's buried there nonetheless. And Chief Justice Taney, of course, is buried at St. John's in Frederick. Brilliant legal mind, but I mean, obviously his decision strongly favored one part of the country and strongly angered another. Yes. But once again, another example of anti-Catholicism coming to the forefront. Yeah. I keep coming back to Arthur Schlesinger Sr., you know, an American historian. He says anti-Catholicism is the deepest bias in the American people. Yeah. And I haven't found anything to prove him wrong yet, really.
No. You hear some, like Senator Hirono and others, you know, show that. I want to thank you, but also want to mention, you know, today is the anniversary of the attacks in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, 18 years ago. And in fact, when the first tower fell, one of the first people killed was a Catholic priest, Father Judge, a Franciscan priest, who, and of course, many of the funerals of the firefighters and police were at St. Patrick's and other Catholic churches, along with all the other people, because it was Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Sikhs, Hindus who died. And we want to pray these days. And a lot of people don't remember this as well, obviously, but it was a significant here. That's when Mother Angelica had her stroke. And so that happened just a few hours before the attacks. A few hours, that's right. About 5 hours before the attacks. And so it was doubly shocking for us here. And I think to keep in mind that one of our goals is to pray not only for the souls of the people who died during the attacks, the ones who died in the years since on many different levels, from diseases, from inhaling, as well as in fighting, you know, against Al-Qaeda. But we want to pray for the repose of their souls. But we also want to pray for an end of the mindset that would want to use terror. This is one type of terror. It's certainly a radical Islamic-inspired terror. But we see the terror that goes on in stores and schools and, you know, local terrorists who are killing people in our country. This is a mindset that is extremely evil, that sees death as the solution to what they want. And we want to pray for conversion away from death toward a love of life as a gift from God. And if you join me in blessing our audience, especially on this memorial, may God bless you and bless all those who have died and give them eternal rest, and fill us with hearts that not only feel his peace, but share it with others. We bless you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Father, as always.
Thank you, and God bless you.